Nate Colby came awake to the sound of his dogs going wild in the yard. The kind of barking that didn't mean a coyote or a raccoon in the henhouse, but something bigger, something that had them backed up against the porch and snarling instead of chasing. He was out of bed and reaching for the rifle propped by the door before he'd fully finished waking, moving on the kind of instinct 6 years of running a ranch alone teaches a man whether he wants it or not. Rustlers had hit the Bar T 2 ranches over back in the spring, driven off 11 head in a single night and left nothing behind but cut fence wire and a sheriff with no leads worth chasing. Nate had told himself since then that his own herd was next on somebody's list eventually, and standing barefoot on his own porch boards with a rifle in his hands and the September night gone cold around him, he figured eventually had arrived. The barn door stood open a crack that hadn't been there when he'd shut it up at dusk. He crossed the yard low and quiet, the dogs falling in behind him now that he was moving instead of ahead of him, and pushed the door wide with the rifle raised and his heart going hard enough that he could hear it over his own breathing. What he found in the lantern light wasn't a rustler crouched over his cattle. It was a woman collapsed in the loose hay near the far stall, one arm flung over a bundle she'd clearly been holding on to right up until she couldn't hold onto consciousness anymore. Her dark green traveling dress torn at the hem and gone the color of the road she'd evidently walked a good long stretch of. Her chestnut hair come loose from its pins and tangled with straw. For one bad second, Nate thought she was dead. Then her chest rose, slow and shallow, and he lowered the rifle and stood there in the dark of his own barn, feeling foolish and unsettled in roughly equal measure, because a woman sleeping in his hay was a stranger kind of trouble than the one he'd braced himself for, and he didn't yet have the first idea what to do about it. He didn't wake her rough. He set the rifle against the stall door and crouched down slow, the way he'd approach a spooked horse, and set her attention toward him with nothing sharper than his own voice. Ma'am, you're on my land." Her eyes came open fast and frightened, and for a moment she scrambled back into the straw like she meant to run, before her body reminded her plainly that it had nothing left to run with. "I'm sorry," she said, the words coming out cracked and dry. "I didn't mean to trespass. I saw the barn and I couldn't go another mile, and I thought I'd just rest a moment and be gone before light. You've been gone from wherever you started a good deal longer than a moment already, by the look of you," Nate said, and reached for the canteen hanging off the stall post, holding it out to her instead of any question. "Drink first, talk after, if you're of a mind to." That was the whole of what she needed to know about him in the first 60 seconds, though neither of them would have called it that at the time. That Nathaniel Colby was a man who fed a stranger before interrogating one, same as it turned out he'd done once before, though that was a story for later telling. She drank the water down too fast and coughed on it, and he waited, patient as fence posts, until she'd caught her breath enough to speak plainly. Her name was Cora Whitfield, she told him, and she'd ridden 2 days from a ranch 40 miles east near the Sweetwater, most of it without stopping longer than it took to water the horse, which she'd finally had to leave behind at a creek crossing 8 miles back when it went lame. She was a widow. Her husband, Daniel Whitfield, had died the previous spring of a fever that took him inside of a week, leaving her a spread of 1,200 acres and better than 300 head of cattle, held in her own name, clean and clear, on account of Wyoming Territory being, as she put it, the one place in the country where a woman's name on a deed actually meant something in a courtroom. It was true, and Nate knew it was true. Wyoming had granted women the vote back in '69, the first territory in the nation to do it, and property rights had followed close behind, which made a woman like Cora Whitfield, alone and landed, a considerably more complicated proposition to certain men than a widow with nothing. Her brother-in-law, Silas Whitfield, had come to call within a month of the funeral, full of sympathy and practical concern for a woman alone, and had suggested, gently at first and then with considerably less gentleness as the months wore on, that the sensible arrangement, the arrangement any reasonable person would see the wisdom of, was for her to marry him and fold Daniel's estate back into the Whitfield name where it belonged. She had refused politely and then plainly. Silas had stopped asking and started insisting, bringing a preacher to the ranch unannounced in August, with the clear expectation that the matter would simply be settled that afternoon whether she'd agreed to it or not. She had locked the door and refused to open it, and 2 nights later, certain he meant to try something less patient than a preacher next time, she had taken what she could carry and ridden out before dawn. Nate listened to all of it without interrupting, the way he generally listened to most things, and when she'd finished, he was quiet long enough that she started to wonder if he believed a word of it. A man doesn't usually go to that much trouble over land he could contest in a courthouse instead, he said finally. Makes me think the land's not the whole of what he's after. Cora looked at him steady. It's the whole of what he'll admit to wanting. I expect the rest of it he hasn't fully admitted to himself yet, and I didn't care to stay around and find out. Fair enough, Nate said, and stood, offering her a hand up out of the hay. You'll want the spare room over a horse stall. Whatever the rest of this turns out to be, we'll sort the particulars out come morning once you've slept somewhere that isn't full of straw. She stayed. Word of a widow taking shelter at the Colby place moved through Larkspur inside of a week, the way word does in a county where everybody's business is eventually everybody's business. And the town had opinions about it, same as it had opinions about most things. Some of those opinions were kind. Mrs. Abernathy at the Mercantile sent over a basket of preserves and a note saying any woman with the sense to run from a man like Silas Whitfield deserved a decent supper waiting for her. Others were considerably less kind, delivered in the particular tone reserved for a widow and a widower under one roof without a ring between them, regardless of how many chaperoned suppers or how carefully Cora kept to the spare room. Nate heard most of it second-hand, and paid it the attention he paid most gossip, which was none at all, though he noticed Cora heard it too and said nothing, only worked harder at the mending and the garden and the accounts he hadn't kept properly since his own wife died, as though she could out-earn the town's doubt through sheer usefulness. He'd lost Margaret 8 years back, in childbed, the baby gone with her inside of a single terrible night that the whole county still spoke of, in the hushed way people speak of things they were grateful not to have witnessed themselves. Nate had buried them both under the same stone and gone back to work the following morning because there hadn't seemed to be another available direction to walk in, and he'd spent 8 years since telling himself the quiet that followed was simply the ordinary shape of a ranch run by one man. He hadn't told Cora any of it directly, not in the first weeks, but she'd found the small grave under the cottonwood behind the house on her second day, and she'd never once asked him about it, only left a bunch of wildflowers there some mornings on her way to the hen house, and Nate had watched her do it from the porch and felt something in his chest that he didn't have a ready name for. It was late October when Silas Whitfield rode into the Colby yard, with 2 hired men flanking him, and an expression that suggested he'd already decided how the conversation was going to end before he'd said a single word of it. Nate came out onto the porch alone, Cora a step behind him in the doorway, her chin lifted the exact way it had been the first morning he'd found her in the barn, fear worn as composure because that was evidently the only way she knew how to wear it. I'm here for my sister-in-law, Silas said, not bothering to dismount. She's confused and grieving and not fit to be making decisions on her own account, and I mean to see her home where she's looked after properly. She looks looked after to me right where she's standing, Nate said, and this is my land, Mr. Whitfield, which means whatever arrangement you've got in mind, You'll be discussing it with me before you discuss it with her. Silas's mouth tightened. This doesn't concern you. This is a family matter. Funny, Nate said. She doesn't strike me as family of yours in any sense that requires her consent be optional. And I'd think carefully before you say your next sentence, because I've already got 3 neighbors riding this road inside the hour on other business. And I don't imagine you're keen on an audience for whatever you were fixing to say next. It was a bluff. Near enough. Nate had sent his hired boy for the sheriff the moment he'd spotted riders on the ridge, same as any prudent man would, but there was no guarantee help would arrive before words turned into something worse. Silas weighed it, the calculation plain on his face, and in the end, he chose to believe the bluff rather than test it. He left with his hired men trailing him, promising loudly that this wasn't finished, that the law would eventually side with a man's rightful claim to family property. Though both Nate and Cora understood plainly enough that no law in the territory backed a single word of that claim, and that Silas knew it too, which was exactly why he'd come armed with intimidation instead of a lawyer. That evening, Cora sat on the porch steps a long while after supper, quiet in a way that worried Nate more than tears would have. I should go, she said finally, when he came to sit beside her. Not back to Silas, just away from here. I've brought trouble to your door twice now, and it isn't going to stop coming as long as I'm standing on your land. You didn't bring the trouble, Nate said. Man brought it himself. Same as he's been bringing it since before I ever knew your name. Leaving here doesn't unmake that, only makes you face it alone, which strikes me as considerably worse than facing it from a porch with somebody standing beside you. She looked at him a long moment in the failing light. Why, she asked, did you let me stay that first morning? You didn't know me from any stranger sleeping rough in a stranger's barn. You could have turned me out onto the road same as you'd have been, within your rights to. Nate was quiet the way he was quiet before most things worth saying properly. I lost my wife in that house 8 years ago, he said, and I've spent every year since telling myself the quiet suited me. Then I found a woman half-starved and half-frozen in my own barn, and something in me recognized what it looks like when somebody's run clean out of anywhere safer to be. Didn't seem like a hard decision at the time. Doesn't seem like one now either. He almost said the rest of it then, the part he'd been turning over privately for weeks without quite trusting himself to say aloud, and got as far as opening his mouth before the words simply wouldn't come. 3 weeks of quietly rehearsed sentences, abandoning him entirely at the moment he most needed them. Cora waited, and when nothing further came, she reached over and set her hand over his on the porch step, plain and steady, the way she did most things. I think, she said, we've both got a habit of going quiet at exactly the moment honesty would serve us better. Working on that, Nate admitted, slower than most things I've learned. Take your time, she said. I've got nowhere pressing to be. They married in the small Larkspur church the following March, with half the county in attendance, including several of the very neighbors whose opinions had once run less than kind, who had come around considerably once the full account of Silas Whitfield's conduct made its way properly through town. Mrs. Abernathy cried through the whole ceremony and claimed she'd known how it would end since the day she'd sent over the preserves. Silas did not attend and was never seen in Larkspur again after that October afternoon, his reputation having traveled the county roads considerably faster than he cared to outride it. Cora kept the bunch of wildflowers growing under the cottonwood, tending the small grave alongside Nate every spring without either of them needing to discuss why. And some mornings, sitting on the porch with coffee going cold in her hands and the Wyoming light coming up gold over land that finally felt like it belonged to both of them equally, she would think back to the night she'd collapsed in a stranger's hay with nothing left to run on, certain she was about to be turned out onto a road road with nowhere else to go. She never had been. He'd handed her water before he'd asked a single question, and everything that mattered afterward had simply followed from that one plain decision, made by a tired man standing in his own barn doorway at midnight, who'd looked at a stranger's trouble and quietly chosen not to look away from it.